The chamber of the Galactic Concord was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It floated above a dying star, encased in a shimmering shell of translucent alloy that refracted time itself. Inside, the most powerful and ancient species of the galaxy had gathered. Towering beings of light, sentient machines that pulsed with data, and creatures older than human language. It was here, in the echoing core of the Concord's judgment hall, that humanity would stand for the first time. And they were laughed at the moment they stepped in. Commander Elena Reyes and historian Jacob Mendez led Earth's delegation. Clad in formal Navy suits bearing Earth's emblems, they looked painfully simple next to the floating monarchs and gravity-bending diplomats of the galactic elite. Their technology didn't hum with dark energy. Their ships didn't warp space with elegance. They walked, on legs, one foot after the other. It was almost embarrassing to watch. The laughter wasn't cruel. Not yet. It was more like the way one might chuckle at a toddler who believed they could fly with cardboard wings. Warm, amused, and utterly dismissive. An 8-limbed ambassador from the Glaveri hive clicked its mandibles in what passed for a smirk. Ah, the humans. Flesh-bound thinkers from a death world of noise and combustion. You brought words. How quaint. Elena didn't flinch. She stepped forward, posture straight, eyes level with the enormous observer screen above them. We come in peace. We come to listen. And if we're permitted, to speak. A few murmurs rippled through the seats, the oldest among them, the crystalline entities of Sildari Prime, remained unmoved, their multicolored facets reflecting the chamber's glow. One of them finally spoke, their voice like wind across glass. You are late to this galaxy, humans. What makes you believe you have something to offer? Jacob cleared his throat. History. Hope. The belief that even in darkness, something better is always possible. The chamber chuckled again, but this time there was a flicker of curiosity beneath the ridicule. Behind Reyes, a holoscreen began displaying Earth's timeline. Its wars, discoveries, collapses, renaissances, the rise of nations, the fall of empires, the first leap into orbit. But for every act of violence, there was an act of kindness. For every mistake, a struggle to correct it. Humanity's greatest failure wasn't hiding, but neither was its resilience. They are chaotic, said a being made entirely of swirling gas. Chaotic, echoed another, and loud. But still here, Rise replied, calmly. The laughter faded, not out of respect, but because they were trying to figure it out. These strange, flawed creatures, why hadn't they destroyed themselves yet? No one said it out loud, but the question hung over the chamber like a storm cloud waiting to burst. And for the first time, the Concord leaned in, not to dismiss, but to listen. The trial of worth began at the strike of the celestial gong, a sound engineered to resonate with every known form of perception, from electromagnetic pulses to the vibration-sensitive skin of aquatic delegates. For the Concord, this was more than a ritual. It was tradition, a ceremonial gauntlet that every candidate species had to pass before earning a single voice among the stars. Most failed. The humans were given the center platform, a circular dais suspended in the air, rotating slowly so each species could observe them from every angle. They stood exposed. No shielding, no podium, no script. Just two representatives, and the weight of their entire planet's worth. A serpentine speaker named Kethrol, whose body coiled around an entire pillar of the chamber, slithered forward with a condescending tone. Humans of Earth, explain the logic of your societal systems. You speak of freedom, yet you permit inequality. You demand peace, yet your histories are soaked in blood. Race didn't blink, because we are flawed, but aware, and that awareness fuels our change. Snickers echoed from the upper tiers. A mollusk-like being from the Erechthel cluster undulated with laughter. So you admit you are broken, and you wish to bring this brokenness into the galaxy. Mendez took this one. Every species here crawled from its own chaos, We just haven't hidden our scars as well. That earned a moment of quiet, though not agreement. The next questions came rapidly. Why do your leaders change so often? Why do you allow individuals to defy your own systems? Why do your people fight over beliefs instead of facts? To the Concord, humanity was not advanced. They were unstable. A risk, an open flame in a chamber full of dry fuel. But beneath the surface, not everyone was laughing. A few species, especially the younger ones on the fringes of the Concord, began to watch more closely. There was something in the humans' refusal to shrink that stirred quiet admiration. They didn't cower. They didn't beg. They answered every accusation with honesty, not pride. And then came the illusions. The chamber darkened. Above them, a projection unfolded. Human history, amplified for effect. Scenes of violence, injustice, and destruction played out in brutal detail. Wars, genocide, slavery, pollution, desperation. The worst of humanity, curated and exaggerated by the Concord's archivists. It was meant to break them. But as the final image faded, Reyes simply said, "You forgot the endings." Mendez followed with, "We didn't stay that way. We moved forward. That's who we are." Silence. For the first time, real silence. Not out of offense, but because no one had ever said that before. Most species, when shown their darkest reflections, crumbled in shame or exploded in denial. But the humans stood in it, owned it. The trial wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time since the laughter began, the galaxy started to wonder. Were the humans here to plead for a seat, or to challenge how the entire chamber defined worth? As the chamber's lights flickered back to life, the atmosphere shifted. The Galactic Concord had seen empires rise and fall, civilizations that traded entire star systems for an ounce of power or progress. But in the wake of humanity's unflinching responses, the questions grew sharper, more insistent. They weren't done testing. The next series of questions was deliberate, calculated to expose the flaws that the humans had yet to reveal. It was time to dig into the heart of their most vulnerable trait, their emotions. A high-ranking delegate from the insectoid's Star Empire, with compound eyes reflecting an iridescent sheen, stepped forward. His voice was a rasp, an unsettling hum that vibrated the air. "You speak of progress, yet your species, humans, are driven by emotion, a primitive instinct that has cost you countless lives. Why do you still allow such weakness to define you?" The chamber fell silent as all eyes turned to Reyes and Mendez. The Star delegate's words hung in the air like a toxin, meant to expose humanity's supposed greatest flaw. Reyes didn't flinch. She understood the question well. We're driven by emotion because it makes us human. We don't hide from our feelings. We embrace them. Our capacity for love, for grief, for hope. These are the very things that push us to fight for something greater than ourselves. Mendez added, "We've lost battles, yes, but we never lose our humanity. It's in our hearts that we find the strength to rise again." The Star ambassador's mandibles clicked in disapproval, but the true attack came from the next speaker, a slick, oily figure from the Akthar collective. Its gelatinous form, twisting and reshaping as it spoke. "Love, hope. These words are the very reason your species has suffered. Emotion is chaos, and in chaos, there is only destruction." Another alien chimed in, this one a being of light, its form shifting like liquid fire. "We removed emotion long ago. It is a weakness, a disruption to the pursuit of knowledge and perfection. You humans cling to it as though it is something to be admired." The mockery was subtle, but it was relentless. The Concord saw emotions as primitive, messy, a trait to be eliminated once a species reached a certain level of sophistication. Their history was filled with cold logic, calculated actions, and stoic calculation. Love was a disease, peace a fleeting illusion. Yet the humans did not falter. Reyes took a deep breath, her voice steady, but carrying an unshakable resolve. We may have fought wars because of our emotions, yes, but we also built hospitals, homes, families, because of those same emotions. They connect us. They drive us to protect one another. And it's not weakness. It's the greatest strength we possess. The chamber murmured, some skeptics still dismissing her words, others considering them with newfound wariness. But one thing was certain. Humanity wasn't just surviving because of intellect or weapons. They were surviving because of something far more powerful, their hearts. And as the chamber sat in contemplative silence, one thing was clear. In a galaxy that prized logic above all else, humanity's most human trait had just become their most dangerous weapon. The chamber grew tense, the air thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts. For the first time, the Galactic Concord was not laughing. The humans had shown resilience. They had held their ground. But in a room filled with some of the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy, their presence was still seen as a wild card, a force that could either destroy or shift the balance in ways no one could predict. It was then that the speaker of the Concord, a being of vast and ancient knowledge from the Tizhal Collective, stepped forward. Unlike the others, it wasn't a creature of flesh or light. The Tizhal was an entity of pure intellect, a sentient consciousness that existed across countless dimensions at once, its form constantly shifting like a fluid mass of information. Its voice was not heard, but felt, an overwhelming wave of thought that vibrated through every mind in the room. Humans, the Tizhal began, its voice both calming and unsettling. You stand before us, unbroken, despite the chaos of your past. You speak of love, of hope, and of your emotions. But we ask you, what is it that truly drives your species? What is it that you would die for, without hesitation, without regret? The question struck like a thunderclap. A silence fell over the room. The thousands of delegates from across the galaxy leaned forward, all attention now focused on the humans. This was no ordinary question. This was the ultimate test of worth, a challenge to the very core of their being. Reyes and Mendez exchanged a glance. They had been asked questions about war, about progress, about humanity's many flaws. But this was different. It was a question that no one had dared to ask before, a question that no species had ever been brave enough to answer. To speak of what they would die for meant revealing a truth too powerful for many to comprehend. The entire chamber waited, an unbearable tension hanging in the air. The Tizhal's presence felt like the weight of the universe pressing down on the humans, testing them in ways no creature had ever been tested. The question was simple, but its implications were vast. Reyes took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the faces of the delegates. She knew this moment would define humanity's future among the stars. With a steady voice, she spoke. For each other, she said, her words firm but clear. For those who cannot protect themselves. For the belief that tomorrow can be better than today. For the hope that no one should have to face the darkness alone. The room went silent. There was no laughter now. No dismissive whispers. The answer reverberated in the chamber, not just in the ears of those present, but in the hearts and minds of every species who had ever stood before the Concord. The words of a species who would risk everything, not for power, not for glory, but for something far more fragile, yet far more powerful. And for the first time, the galaxy felt something shift. It wasn't fear. It wasn't admiration. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be measured by any algorithm or standard of logic. It was respect. The silence stretched on, hanging thick and heavy over the chamber. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. The delegates, once so eager to question and criticize, sat frozen in a collective pause. The words Commander Reyes had spoken had shattered the predictable rhythm of the trial. They were simple words, yet they carried a weight that no one could deny. For each other. It echoed in the minds of the delegates, reverberating across species that had long since buried their capacity for selflessness, their ability to care without calculation. The concept was so foreign to the galactic elite that it seemed almost impossible. For each other. Not for a government, not for a planet, not for a throne or a crown, but for the very idea of a fellow being, a stranger, a life that existed outside the boundaries of one's own self-interest. The tea hall, ancient and wise beyond measure, had never been challenged in this way. For it, emotions were an anomaly, a glitch in the perfect order of the universe. In its vast consciousness, the notion of self-sacrifice for another was unnecessary. Why die for another? It could not fathom the answer. It was illogical, dangerous, and yet, in the moment, it could not dismiss the sincerity in Reyes's voice. Mendez, standing at her side, added, "We fight for the ones we don't even know. We fight for the future, for the promise of a better world. We don't seek victory for ourselves. We seek it for everyone we can reach. We risk our lives for those who may never even know our names." The words were simple, but they cut deep into the heart of the room, into the deepest recesses of the galaxy's oldest civilizations. These were creatures who had spent millennia refining their strategies, calculating every move. To them, survival and progress were governed by cold, unyielding logic. They had conquered their emotions, buried them under layers of reason and control. But humans had not. They lived in the raw, untamed spaces between their hearts and minds. Their passions, their desires, their love for the people around them were not weaknesses. They were the source of their strength. It was the reason they did not surrender, the reason they did not bend under the weight of the universe's challenges. The chamber was still, the delegates caught in the tension of a thought they had never dared entertain. Some of them began to feel an uncomfortable shift in their own consciousness. They had laughed at the humans, mocked them, believed their emotions were a sign of inferiority. But now, as the words hung in the air, they began to question whether they had misjudged them entirely. Reyes's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had once dismissed her species as nothing more than a footnote in the galaxy's history. She stood tall, her voice unwavering as she added, "This is why we will never be conquered. Because when it matters most, we stand together. And that makes us unstoppable." The room remained silent, but the change was undeniable. The humans had not come to beg for a place at the table. They had come to show the galaxy something it had long forgotten: the power of humanity. And in that moment, the galactic elites realized they had been facing not a weak species, but a force that could change the very fabric of the galaxy itself. The chamber was still, the tension palpable in the air, yet something had changed. The once mocking whispers had faded, replaced by a growing uncertainty. It was as if the very air had shifted, bending around the humans and their unwavering answer. In a room filled with the mightiest civilizations in the galaxy, it was not the weapons they wielded or the empires they controlled that commanded the most attention. It was the humans' answer, so simple, so pure, and yet so profoundly different. The delegates of the Galactic Concord, who had once dismissed humanity's presence as an amusing distraction, now found themselves forced to confront the stark reality of their own beliefs. Their logic, their cold, calculated approach to existence, had been shaken. The question they had posed, "What would humanity die for?" was meant to expose the supposed fragility of Earth's species. But instead, it had revealed a truth none of them had been prepared for. The ancient Sildari, whose bodies were composed of living crystal, shifted slightly, the facets of their forms catching the light in strange, shimmering patterns. Their silence was not one of disdain anymore, but of contemplation. They were beings who had long transcended the physical, existing in a state of pure reason, and yet, for the first time, they were confronted with an idea that did not fit neatly into their understanding of the universe. One of the Sildari spoke, its voice soft yet resonating with the weight of eons. "You speak of emotions as strength, but emotion is unpredictable. It is volatile. A species that relies on it cannot be relied upon to maintain stability. Your very survival is a gamble." Reyes didn't flinch. "Then perhaps we're gamblers. But we choose to play the game. We don't fear the unpredictability, because in the chaos, there's beauty. There's growth. We fight for more than survival. We fight for what's worth saving." The response was simple, yet it hit harder than any weapon. The Sildari paused, processing, recalculating their assessment of humanity. It was clear they had underestimated the humans, and that misjudgment was starting to feel dangerous. A soft hum came from the Akthar collective. The oily, shifting form of its representative seemed to waver, its gelatinous surface rippling with unease. The Akthar, whose species had long discarded all emotion in favor of absolute logic, found themselves at a loss. How could a species be so illogical and yet so effective? In their own minds, they had long believed emotion to be a primitive burden. The human answer had cracked that perception wide open, forcing them to rethink their approach. What if, the Akthar delegate asked cautiously, your emotions betray you? What if they make you weak, cause you to fall when it matters most? Reyes stood firm, her gaze steady. Our emotions make us human, not weak. They drive us to fight when the odds are impossible, to protect what others would abandon, to love when there's no reason to. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, a collective understanding creeping over the delegates. The logical minds of the Concord were now struggling to reconcile something they had long dismissed as irrelevant. Humanity's resilience wasn't in their technology, but in their will. The room was no longer filled with mockery. It wasn't filled with certainty either, but something had undeniably shifted. Where there had once been a gleam of superiority in the eyes of the delegates, now there was a trace of doubt, a trace of curiosity. The humans had done something that no species in the Concord had ever done before. They had disrupted the very foundation upon which the galaxy's power was built. And for the first time, the galactic elites realized that this flawed species might be more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. As the delegates of the Galactic Concord sat in stunned silence, the realization began to sink in. Humanity was not the simple, primitive species they had assumed. No, they were something different, something that could not be easily dismissed. In their hearts, the humans carried an undeniable strength, and that strength had now become a potential threat to the very order the Concord had worked so long to establish. The Tithal, whose vast consciousness had been quietly observing the proceedings, finally spoke. Its voice, though ethereal, reverberated through the minds of every being in the room. You claim that emotion gives you strength, humanity. But emotion, when unchecked, breeds chaos. Your inability to control it, your need to fight for others, leaves you vulnerable to manipulation. You have no sense of true order. Reyes raised her chin, her eyes locking onto the Tizhal's shifting form. Perhaps you're right. We are unpredictable, but in that unpredictability lies our greatest asset. We have the power to change the rules, to redefine what others think is possible. The Tizhal's presence seemed to pulse, like an expanding wave of thought. The other delegates, though physically unmoving, were clearly affected by the tension that was building. What had started as a diplomatic meeting was now teetering dangerously close to a moment of reckoning. The humans had done something that no one else had dared to do. They had forced the Concord to confront its own arrogance. One of the Sildari spoke again, but this time its voice was laced with uncertainty. What you suggest is a fundamental shift. The foundation of the Concord has been built on control, on order. Your species cannot be allowed to disrupt that stability. Mendez's voice was calm, but his words cut through the thickening tension. We're not here to disrupt the order. We're here to offer a different path, one that doesn't require the death of individuality for the sake of survival. One that recognizes that there is strength in being different, in embracing the unknown. A murmur spread through the chamber. It wasn't just the humans who were speaking now, but the very idea of what humanity stood for. The audacity to challenge the status quo and redefine it. The quiet voices of some of the younger species, those who had once been ignored or sidelined, began to rise in support. They had been watching, learning from the humans' unyielding stance, and for the first time, they felt as if they had a voice, too. Perhaps, a voice from the Arakthil delegation said, its 6 arms folding in contemplation. It is not order that has held us together for millennia, but fear of the chaos we all thought impossible to control. Perhaps the humans are not the threat, but the idea they represent. A ripple of agreement passed through the room. It was a small shift, but it was enough to make the Concord's most powerful members nervous. The greatest threat wasn't a weapon, a fleet, or a superpower. It was the possibility that humanity might be right, that there was another way to exist, one that didn't require the sacrifice of individuality for the sake of peace. The chamber became a battlefield of ideas, and in that moment, humanity wasn't just fighting for its place in the stars. It was fighting for the very idea that they could change everything. The chamber was in turmoil, but it was no longer the chaos of anger or ridicule. It was the quiet, unsettling stirrings of a shift too profound for any of the delegates to ignore. The humans had introduced a concept so alien, so contradictory to the foundations of the Galactic Concord, that it left the galaxy's most powerful minds questioning everything they had believed. The debate continued to grow more heated, but it was no longer about facts or figures. It was about something far deeper, what the humans represented. The idea that a species so young, so flawed, could stand before the greatest civilizations in the galaxy and challenge them was unsettling. Yet it was clear that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their weapons or technology. It was in their will, their refusal to be defined by anyone but themselves. The Tizhal's ethereal voice reverberated through the minds of the delegates once more, softer now, as though searching for an answer it had not expected to find. You claim your unpredictability is strength, yet it is also your greatest vulnerability. What happens when your emotions betray you? What happens when your chaos turns to madness? Reyes took a slow step forward, her gaze unwavering. Then we fall, and we get back up again. That's the human way. We don't pretend to be perfect, and we don't hide from our mistakes. We learn from them. That's why we endure. The response sent a shiver through the room. The Tizhal was not used to a species who embraced its imperfections. To them, humanity's refusal to conform was a risk, a danger that could undermine everything the Concord had built. And yet there was something undeniably human in that response, a relentless drive to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. A ripple of thought passed through the delegates. Some were still resolute in their belief that humanity was too dangerous, too unpredictable to be allowed into the fold. But others were starting to see the possibility in humanity's words. They began to see the humans not as a threat to be neutralized, but as something else, something necessary. If you refuse to conform, the voice of the Sildari resonated. What will you bring to the table? What is it that you offer us, if not your capacity for destruction? Mendez's eyes narrowed, his voice calm but unwavering. We offer something you've forgotten. We offer hope. Hope that no matter how dark it gets, we can rise again. Hope that we don't have to destroy each other to create peace. Hope that maybe we don't have to be perfect to be valuable. A silence fell over the chamber. It wasn't the silence of disbelief, but of understanding. The delegates of the Concord, long accustomed to measuring everything in terms of power and control, now found themselves grappling with an idea they had never considered. What if there was strength and hope? And for the first time, the question was no longer whether humanity would be allowed a seat at the table. It was whether the galaxy could afford not to give them one.